doing the questions and answers. And could you mention that there's a hashtag?
Yes, I can.
Oh, we need to use that.
All right.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Carolina Rogge. I'm co-director of the Sussex Energy Group, and on behalf of Benjamin, who's going to say something in a minute, we all like to welcome you to our first SEG annual lecture, and we're really excited to have with us the Director General of IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, Adnan Amin. It's a pleasure to have you. Adnan actually did study here, so it's like a homecoming for him. We're really thrilled to have him talk about disruption in the energy system from the renewables perspective. But let me just quickly introduce you to the Sussex Energy Group and then to IRENA before I hand over to Benjamin. So one reason to initiate this annual lecture was our desire to engage widely with our aim of understanding and fostering low-carbon sustainable energy transitions. And so inviting people from the outside world to us and engaging with them is one important part of that. But it's of course also to reach out and provide this kind of discussion space for our students, our MSc and PhD students, to engage with those who are actually working on the energy transition. So we are really happy that you have made room to engage with our MSc and PhD students already earlier today. We are looking forward to listening to your talk. Much of what we do resonates with what you're doing at IRENA. And let me just, we have a bit of a longer history. IRENA was the founding decision made in 2009 and then came into real existence in 2011. So actually quite young intergovernmental organization, but the only one which is fully committed to renewable energy and with a nearly global reach. So from some 70, 80 member states who signed the founding agreement, it's now, some 170 or so member states that you have, and had seen a quite tremendous growth. Of course, you're existing in a diverse global energy governance landscape with IEA, the International Energy Agency, and others promoting petroleum or nuclear energy. So in that space you have made yourself very quickly a big name. And I just wanted to highlight two things. Of course, there are many things that we could talk about, but just two things, because we are here, many of us from SPRU, where we look at innovation. I wanted to highlight the thing that actually IRENA is also really actively engaging in seeking out innovation in renewable energy. Just one thing, if you want to get easy data on patents, you can go to the IRENA website for renewables. You can see the trends there. Another thing is the Innovation Week that you initiated 2 years ago. And just to highlight that, where they already talked about the systemic perspective on innovation, so not only technological innovation, but really resonating with what our research is doing on a transitions perspective, which goes beyond technology and takes on to the social considerations as well. Or just this year, when you did this again, reaching out to, okay, what are the trends in energy system digitalization, electrification, decentralization, right? Social innovation, so really broadening the scope. The other thing I wanted to mention is that IRENA has been doing a terrific job in providing a repository of knowledge on all kind of things for renewable energy. So that's something that we direct our students to, of course, and you're doing a fantastic job putting like the competition. They just have to catch up with you, so we thank you for that. I'm going to hand over to Benjamin to actually say something about introducing you, and then we hand over to you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Can we get some applause? This will be brief. which is hard for me, for those of you that know me. I'm Benjamin Sovacool, Director of the Sussex Energy Group with Carolyn and Professor of Energy Policy here. Adnan, I printed this out because some of the titles he's had are quite interesting, does have a 25-year history promoting things like renewable energy, sustainable development, environmental governance. He was there at IRENA when it started in 2011, and he's been there since. So he's the founding, as well as the longest standing and first of their Director Generals. Before then, he really worked a lot at UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, and this is the one I wanted to print out. He was also Executive Director of the Secretariat of the Secretary General's High-Level Panel on UN System-Wide Coherence, which is quite a mouthful. He also did attend, as Carolyn said, University of Sussex, I won't tell you when, a little bit ago, where he graduated from Degree in Development Studies, so IDS. And then lastly, I just wanted to say, why did we invite him? We did have a lot of deliberation about who our first speaker would be, and the decision was unanimous for you, by the way. And I remember we were looking at speakers, we came across some things you had said in 2017 in Berlin, one of which was that the energy transition is no longer a rich man's game. It is becoming available for all. And the other thing is that the business case for renewables never has been stronger. And I think those convinced us that this is a speaker worth listening to. And so with that, please come and tell us about the age of disruption and renewable energy. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Can you hear me? Does it work? Yep. Thank you for a very kind introduction. But I want to ask, why did it take you 30 years to bring me back to Sussex? I had such a great time when I was here. I was a bit younger and not married, and it was a wonderful environment to be in, intellectually also. And let me say, some of my fondest memories are still with me. And this was a very special institution, and I want to say that, having institutions like SPRU, the Sussex Energy Group, the Institute of Development Studies, which was mine, really puts this institution in the front ranks of academic institutions around the world. The only thing I want to say is marketing needs to be a little bit better, but we can work on that. But it's a great pleasure to see you, and thank you so much for your kind words and for describing the process through which you selected me. I thought it was not even a competition, but clearly. And I had forgotten what a challenging academic environment this is, because they brought me here at 3 o'clock and they've taken 4 hours grilling me with graduate students, faculty, all sorts of people talking about different things. So in a way, my mind is already scrambled. So I was going to read some things, but I don't think I'll be able to now. But I'll just refer to it so that I have a guide of how I wanted to talk about these issues. But first of all, I want to say that, I wanted to congratulate Benjamin because he's been appointed to head the IPCC Working Group on Mitigation and Development Pathways. And I think we are all familiar with the recent IPCC report and the implications of that report. We have just over a decade to address the emissions that we're seeing today. The energy sector accounts for 2/3 of those. So the work of your working group is going to be particularly crucial. And wish you the best and to provide our full support to you in taking that work forward, because it has never been more important than it is today. I spent more than 20 years working on climate policy in the UN. And it was only at the disastrous Copenhagen conference, this is not a diplomatic setting, so I can be quite frank, the disastrous Copenhagen conference, which is, I was in the delegation of the Secretary General of the UN, so I had a front row seat to what happened there, when it became very clear that political and intergovernmental discussions designed to address climate were not having any traction, that the positions were just too diverse, the political momentum was not there, the sense of common purpose had not united the international community for what is probably going to be the defining feature of our lifetimes, and especially of the lifetimes of you younger people here. There are a few of you here, I think. And I think that that's what attracted me to IRENA. Just to give you a little sense of how it happened, I had never heard of it before. But apparently there was this process. It started with the founding conference in 2009. There was an intergovernmental process of discussion. The UAE, nobody expected, won the bid to host the organization because as an oil-producing country, they were looking at diversifying their economy. They were interested in being an energy economy in the future also, and they saw renewables as the way. And they invested a huge amount to bring the agency to be headquartered in the UAE. First time in the Middle East in a Muslim country to have an international organization of this stature. So incredibly important that it succeed, not only because of energy, but for a whole host of other reasons, political reasons also. And I remember one of my earliest discussions when I was first elected to IRENA was I was called in to speak to Hillary Clinton, who was then Secretary of State. And she looked at me and said, "We need to make this work. I don't care how you do it, but you need to make this work because one is our future in climate, but two is we need to project an image of international cooperation working out of the Middle East that brings some level of international consensus back together again." So it was very important for two reasons. So when we started, there were no people, there was no program. There had been a very fractious discussion about setting up the agency. But what was becoming very clear at that time was that we were moving away from this perception that you mentioned, Benjamin, that renewables were for rich people or Germans who had engineering capability and a lot of money, but nobody else. It was not a feasible possibility. And that was beginning to change. I remember the first time I ever came across the idea of what an international institution of this sort should be was at the Rio Plus 20. It's been a long time since Rio Plus 10 in Johannesburg, when the negotiations on energy failed. And the fallback was the Germans advanced the idea of creating an institution like this, and this was the argument of the developing countries. Stop sidetracking us with your fringe technologies which have no basis in reality. We want to talk about real stuff and we want to talk about economics. So when we started, there was momentum beginning, cost declines were beginning to happen, but there was no international framework through which this could be discussed. There was no platform for international cooperation. There was no way that developed and developing countries could have a structured conversation around the prospect of renewables, either on technology or cost or the business case and so on. So when we started, because of my experience in climate, I decided very clearly that we don't talk about climate change at all in IRENA. We talk about technology, we talk about cost, we talk about innovation, we talk about how we can manage intermittency of renewables and systems, and we talk about how this can be transformative from an economic point of view because it's a form of investment that generates income, that generates value in the economy, that allows for innovation processes to be mainstream in the economy. It allows for much higher levels of public welfare. But if you talk about climate, you immediately put it into a ghetto of the climate negotiations out of which it wouldn't come. So that was a very deliberate decision. We also decided it was time to create a new type of institution. And I think this is as important as the technical issues we're dealing with is the institutional design. I don't know if there are any students of international relations here, but the organizations that were created after the Second World War have become somewhat inflexible. Benjamin mentioned one of my roles. Essentially, it was a reform process that Kofi Annan launched in his last year as Secretary General, which he asked me to lead, which was co-chaired by 3 prime ministers and a prime minister in waiting because Gordon Brown was one of the panel members. We had a very interesting panel. And the idea was to re-engineer the development, humanitarian, and environmental work of the United Nations. It was called System-Wide Coherence or Delivering as One. I don't know if some of you may have heard of this. And it was one of the reform initiatives that actually had some impact. But what became very clear to me is that because of the design of the institutions and the political processes that underpin them, it was not possible anymore, given the fast-moving trends we were dealing with, that institutions of that design were able to keep up with that kind of momentum. So we designed an institution that was flexible, that was light, that was adaptive, that responds to specific needs of members, and that could do multiple functions. You know, you could walk and chew gum at the same time in an institution, which, you know, the older institutions were having difficulty doing. So that's what we tried to develop. But since then, looking at what has happened in the renewable space has been remarkable. First of all, our membership is moving towards universal. I was told by students of international institutions that this is probably the fastest process of ratification of a legal treaty, because IRENA is a treaty-based organization, that has happened since the Second World War. And I think it is because it actually provides you with an optimistic and positive vision of the future that is also coincidentally achievable. That is what renewables has come to represent today. And I know there are many issues and discussions around this and so on. I was going to talk a lot about some of the details of this, but I want to share with you maybe today just a bigger picture so that I don't have to read the statistics in the note. One is, one of the extraordinary trends that we have seen with this technology since, you know, around the creation of IRENA, say you take 2010 as a benchmark, is the levelized cost of electricity from renewables has fallen dramatically. For solar PV, 73%. For onshore wind, about 30%. For offshore wind, 25%. We maintain a database of about 18,000 real-life projects around the world, utility scale investment, and we measure cost from all of these, and then we project from that in terms of the innovation processes we're seeing, how this is going to go further. We're projecting that in the next decade, we will see solar PV continue to fall, maybe around 60%. If new disruptive technologies come in, for example, if we are able to commercialize perovskite technologies and so on, it could be an even steeper fall. It could be sooner than a decade. Offshore wind has great potential for rapid price decreases. We're seeing new technologies which are extremely disruptive. You know, topic is disruptive, so extremely disruptive, like we were just talking a little bit earlier about the prospect for floating offshore wind. The initial tests which are happening with high wind in the North Sea and with the Japanese tests of Japan show that you can use commercially floating offshore wind while decreasing the cost of offshore wind by 30% with a very reliable business case. This is revolutionary in terms of how the areas that you can now use. You know, it's significant for Japan because the Japanese continental shelf falls off very suddenly. It's very deep water. You cannot have fixed platforms offshore from Japan. Floating wind gives you tremendous capability to generate power in an energy-poor country like Japan. Prospect of energy security for Japan starts to appear. So cost decreases have been substantial, but if you add to that the fact that we are also seeing the cost of battery storage, both for stationary and mobile applications, will also decrease over the next decade by about 60%. I personally think that it'll be even quicker than that because I spent a lot of time in China talking to some of the technology companies in China who are investing in battery storage, talking to BYD, talking to Envision and others. The CEO of one of these companies told me, you know, Elon Musk is very good at public relations because everybody talks about his gigafactory. I'm setting up 5 factories which are bigger than his gigafactory in China, and I'm going to slash the cost of storage with batteries, and I'm experimenting with new chemistries for these batteries which will liberate us from rare earth type of issues with the battery technologies. So this is happening. So technology innovation is moving very fast. People believe that this is limited to a few economies where innovation is happening. So let me share with you another disruptive idea. 2 years ago, I was invited to be on the jury of the Russian Energy Prize. The Russian Energy Prize always goes to nuclear scientists or, engineers for fossil or gas or oil. I was invited 2 years ago, and that was the first year a scientist working on solar technology won the Russian Energy Prize, which was presented to him by President Putin. He was a Swiss scientist working on perovskites, who's pioneering this thin film solar technology, which has the potential, if it stabilizes outside laboratory conditions, to drop the cost of solar almost immediately by 30 to 40%. Solar today is generating electricity at under 3 cents a kilowatt hour. To give you an example, the world record last year was in the UAE for 2.9 US cents a kilowatt hour. The comparable cost for electricity generation from new gas at that time in the UAE was about 14 US cents. The adoption of renewable energy in the Middle East is moving at an exponential rate. So just to give you a few examples. The UAE, which has built its wealth on the basis of petrochemicals and oil and gas, has now committed to an energy strategy which by 2050 they want 44% renewables in their system with 70% decarbonization of their economy. This is an economy that has probably the highest per capita carbon emissions in the world. Decarbonization by 70% by 2050. And you ask yourself the question, well, we always hear Europe is in the lead on this. Well, things are changing. I went to one of the investment forums, the first one in Saudi Arabia. It was held at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Luckily, I left on time because 2 weeks later it turned into some other use. But it was very interesting for me at that time because it became apparent in the discussions that the Saudi authorities fully understand that if they don't diversify their economy, they are going to be a net energy importer in 10 years' time. And if you think about what that does to an economy that is based purely on income from exported hydrocarbons, they hit a wall. So their economic diversification program is looking at aggressive movement on renewables. They've already committed to a 10% target by 2023. That's in 5 years' time, from 0 to 10%. There have been talk of deals with guys like Masayoshi Son. I don't know if you know who Masayoshi Son is. He's a very big telecoms guy in Japan, billionaire, SoftBank, who's also investing in renewables and very passionate about renewables. And he's talking about making a deal for 200 gigawatts of power generated from renewables in Saudi Arabia. Both solar, mostly solar, but some wind also. I was invited a few weeks ago in August to attend the throne ceremony of His Majesty the King of Morocco. It was very strange because I'd never met him, and somehow the head of the protocol at the court called me and said he wants you to come. So if a king tells you to come, you have to go. You don't have much choice. So I went there. It was a wonderful event. I mean, it was a great setting in Tangiers with a very traditional ceremony. And I had a short private conversation with him where he asked me, where I talked about the renewables program in Morocco, which is very exciting. They're targeting 52% renewables by 2030 from zero more than 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago. They are looking for energy self-sufficiency, and they're looking to become exporters of energy. And they have some of the most iconic investment in solar, including concentrated solar, where they have reduced the cost of concentrated solar, the levelized cost of electricity, to around 8 cents a kilowatt hour. With storage, which means almost 24 hours a day, they're running on solar, and it's powering about 1 million households in Morocco. So he asked me if I had been to see the plant in the Sahara Desert, and I said, no, I haven't had that pleasure. And he said, well, you're going tomorrow. I said, well, I was planning to go back to New York. He said, no. So they flew me down to the desert, and it is remarkable. The feat of engineering and construction and innovation and vision that has gone into that investment, which is creating the prospect, which the Germans used to talk about a lot, using the Sahara Desert as a resource for solar electricity that would power Europe. These people are making it happen. And they're making it happen at a cost of 8 cents for almost 24 hours electricity. And the prospect is that their next investments are going to lower that price quite substantially, 20 to 30% by some counts. Then you move to China. We know that without China, there is no solution to the global energy issue. There isn't it. I spent a lot of time in China, and I've got to know the Chinese decision makers on energy at the national level quite well. Last year, China installed 53 gigawatts of solar photovoltaic. 53 gigawatts is the entire installed capacity of the United States, which is the second biggest market in the world. And just to add on to that, they installed 23 gigawatts of wind in 1 year. And how are they managing this? It's probably the biggest electrical system in the world. So I spoke to the chief executive of the State Grid of China. They have 2 million people who work for the State Grid of China, but they operate the entire grid from one room in a facility in Beijing, where they're able to see in real time every generating asset in China, the performance of that asset, any problems on the line, and they're able to address these things in real time. And they've developed tools, flexibility mechanisms, that allow them to integrate this level of variable renewables into their system, absolutely reliable. They built a lot of capacity in a short period of time. There was a huge problem of curtailment when plants were not able to produce. The electricity couldn't be sold to the system. They have built thousands of miles of high voltage, ultra high voltage transmission lines across the country that are transporting renewable electricity, huge volumes, from the generating sites in the south and in the extreme west to the load centers in the east, to the big cities. Working perfectly. If China is unable to decarbonize its economy in the next 10 years at a sufficient level, your job with the IPCC is not going to be worth anything. And look at India. I was invited to the first Reinvest conference that Prime Minister Modi held in India. He announced a target of 100 gigawatts of solar PV and 70 gigawatts of wind, which they've since revised upwards by another 50 gigawatts by 2025, I think it was, 2025 or 2027. Massive investment. And it's working in India. India has already installed 70 gigawatts of renewable electricity. And they're doing it at a cost without subsidy, which is beating conventional generation. And the latest bids in the auctions in India have brought the cost of levelized cost of electricity from renewables below that of coal. This is what is giving us all hope. And this is what we're seeing in China, in India, in the Middle East. We know the European discussion. Despite all the difficulties, I don't listen to the news anymore because I don't want to hear the word Brexit, but if you look at the European context, there was a very fractious discussion on energy policy in the last round. We had the 2020 target. There was a negotiation about what the next generation of targets should be. The proposal put on the table by the European Council was 27%. The European Commissioner for Energy called me and said, look, I'm really worried about this because we need to have a much higher level of ambition in Europe. And if we go in this direction, it's going to have a chilling effect on European competitiveness, on the European renewables industry, and on innovation and research and development in Europe. It's going to send a very negative message, especially when we see competitors in the other parts of the world moving so fast. So they asked us to undertake a study of the EU countries. We worked with the energy ministry of every country to gather the data, look at the resource potential, look at the technology choices that are open, and we came up with a very well-structured, well-argued report that had that made the prognosis that it was possible to achieve 34% renewables in the next round by 2030, with a net positive economic scenario. This was the only analytical content in the political discussion in Europe. And it had an immediate effect because it had the force of the European Commission behind it. And the result was we got a 32% target. So I think that what we are seeing now is a disruption in energy markets, in energy sources, that is not switching one fuel for another. It's not that we have this system and we distribute energy and that we either use nuclear or we use, diesel or we use renewables. It is that we are looking at the evolution of a completely new ecosystem of energy that is going to be decentralized, that is going to be democratized, and that's going to be digitized. It's going to be a smart system. It's going to be an ecosystem that connects consumers and producers in new ways. It creates prosumers, people who produce and consume electricity. Look at Germany. In the German electricity market, there are more than 6 million sellers of electricity to the national grid. This includes households, includes communities, includes people who have just one asset. It includes a community that owns 2 wind turbines, and it includes big generators. You have transmission system operators in Germany, who are operating systems with over 50% variable renewables in the system with absolute reliability, and they're doing it because it's not only innovation in technology that is driving this. It's innovation in policies, it's innovation in regulation, and it's innovation in business models. And that kind of innovation is allowing the flexibility in the system in Germany, in Denmark, and Denmark has set the record for the number of days where they run with 100% electricity in a year, and allowing them to do it with absolute reliability. They have perfected forecasting techniques which allow them to see wind speeds and solar insolation rates, up to 48 hours in advance with about 96% reliability. They have started to introduce artificial intelligence and blockchain trading in their system that allows you to run a market that can do trades at intervals of minutes, not hours. They have introduced flexibility through interconnections with other economies, so they can use the hydro that comes from Scandinavia to balance the intermittency. And the transmission system operator, 50 Hertz, the CEO, was telling me that there was this panic in Germany when they were expecting a total eclipse of the sun last year. So everybody was waiting for Germany to close down, and the big guys were waiting, okay, this is our chance to bring back nuclear, this is our chance to get our gas turbines sold, and so on. And he said they managed it without 1 second of interruption because of the flexibility mechanisms they have in the system. So things are changing. The picture for developing countries is also a positive one. There's a sense, I'm from a developing country and I see what is happening in these countries, and there's always been this sense in the development discussion, it was always one of my gripes about it, is that we need this development assistance model because the providers of development assistance know better than the recipients what they need, and somehow this is going to transform economies. It hasn't worked for about 50 years. But what we are seeing now is a sense in many of these countries, which have been through now a period of growth, that this is a genuine leapfrogging opportunity for those countries. In my own country, in Kenya, we are one of the world leaders on geothermal. Our geothermal installations over the last few years allowed the last election to go the same way that the previous one went because they were able to reduce electricity consumer tariffs by 30% before the election. Made all the difference. And they're able to do it with geothermal, which is almost baseload power, if you are taking care of the resource. But then you add to that new wind and new solar build in Kenya is coming in at around 8 or 9 cents a kilowatt hour, with the projection that it is going to go down quite dramatically. It gives you an entirely new picture of how the electricity system of developing countries would look. And then they look at the whole issue of, if we're looking at infrastructure investment, what is it going to do for us? What's the macroeconomic impact of infrastructure investment? Is this the kind of multiplier effect we're looking for development? And you find this with renewables. It generates employment. We do employment numbers worldwide every year, and we're anticipating that, we know that last year, 10.3 million people worked in renewables around the world. Coal jobs, in the context of renewable jobs, are minuscule today. So when you hear this argument in the United States that somehow renewables may kill coal jobs, actually gas killed coal jobs a long time ago. So that trend had already started. So macroeconomic positive impacts on health, being able to address the externalities that we were never able to address with neoclassical economic policy. All of this is beginning to happen in developing countries, and even those that were slow to move have now started to move ahead. I was in Singapore a couple of weeks ago where we signed a memorandum of understanding with all ASEAN member states. I was telling the colleagues anecdote that one of the ministers from a country that shall be unnamed was telling me that, look, you want to know what I think about renewables? And I said, yeah, sure, tell me what you think about renewables. He said, well, if you look at the clothes we're wearing today, for me that's like fossil fuels. Renewables is like wearing banana leaves. Well, I said, well, in some places they could be seen as very fashionable type of dress that, depends on your taste. But this was actually a viewpoint that a senior decision maker on energy in a very important country in the ASEAN region actually had. Until renewables started bringing prices that were way below what new fossil build in that country was generating. And the ground started being cut from under the feet of conventional energy decision makers around the world. And if you look at every region, you look at Latin America today, Chile is generating wind and solar at some of the lowest costs in the world, around 2 cents a kilowatt hour. We're moving into a new smart era, a smart ecosystem of energy that is going to be dependent on new innovative forms of social and economic organization as well as new types of technology. That is not going to be any more a centralized generation of electricity and distribution. I was telling Johan earlier, he didn't fully believe me, but we're moving within the next decade to an era where electricity is going to be close to zero. So if you're in an era where electricity is close to zero, you are in a situation where the old model of centralized generation and selling electricity to consumers doesn't work anymore. Those big centralized generating assets that you could sell the consumer for 20 cents a kilowatt hour electricity is not going to be there because electricity is going to cost 1 or 2 cents. So what are we going to value? Look at what happened to some of the major utilities in Europe a couple of weeks ago. When E.ON and RWE in Germany failed to anticipate the impact of decentralized generation and the rise of renewables, these were cast iron, utilities. They were among the strongest companies in the country. They lost half their market capitalization within 1 year. That's billions of euros. Until they learned the lesson, and then, the E.ON split its business into two, and you have a new company dealing with renewables. So I think that what we're seeing in terms of the regional component is a tremendously fast-moving framework. But the next level of disruption is going to come from innovation in technology, in business models, and in policies. I talked a little bit about that. But I think that what we're also seeing is what is going to happen in the end-use sectors. Because right now, if you're able to put renewables into electricity, it's more or less a done deal. I mean, this is the direction it's going. The economics is driving this. But the bulk of energy used is in end-use sectors. It's in heating, it's in cooling, it's in industry, it's in transportation. And there are some very exciting developments here also that are driven by renewable electricity. One is electric mobility, and we were talking a little bit earlier, been a lot of discussions today. So electric mobility is, in my view, going to be the shape of the future of mobility. We are already seeing massive investment in R&D in China. I already spoke about what's happening with mobile applications for batteries. Costs are going to come down dramatically, and we're going to see electric mobility in light transport move very quickly. I know for a fact, I've been in some discussions, I'm one of those people who, despite the fact they don't like me, they invite me. It's Goldman Sachs for some of these strategic discussions. And one of those is that the big prestige automakers in Europe have realized that they underestimated the momentum of electric mobility, and they have underinvested in R&D. If you take into account the climate discussion, you take into account the diesel scandal that happened with German automobiles, and you take into account the fact that trade restrictions are beginning to cut off markets for prestige automakers from Europe, you have a very big event in the offing, and that big event is the advent of electric mobility with cars that are more reliable. The cost of ownership is much lower for comparable cars. Performance is much better. You don't have to change the oil. You don't have to look at the brake fluid ever again. You don't have to even know what is a distributor. You don't have to know what is a carburetor anymore. There's a motor, there's a battery, there's a platform. Thing works, and it's going to be connected to the grid. If we have millions of electric vehicles that are connected to the grid, then the whole issue of storage is in your fingertips. And if you have smart systems, smart grid installations, it's going to make all the difference. I was telling somebody a bit earlier that in the state grid of China has installed 450 million smart meters throughout China, two-way smart meters, quite advanced. The CEO of NL told me that 2 years ago they made the decision that all the new fiber optic cabling that was being laid in Italy would also have the capability to connect smart meters. He already has the infrastructure in place, and he's implementing an important program for smart metering in Italy. So one of the issues for electric mobility in the future is going to be infrastructure. How are you going to charge these things? Where are you going to charge them? Do you know today who the biggest investors in charging infrastructure are? In Europe, it's Shell and BP. In the US, it's Exxon. They don't talk about it, and if they are asked about it, they say, oh, it's a very small part of our business. But they are understanding that there is a transformation of energy systems coming, and they want to continue to be energy players in the future. And Pouyanné, the CEO of Total, has told me personally that he knows this is going to happen, and he's positioning Total for this eventuality. Oil companies are moving in that direction. If you look at some of them, Statoil of Norway has now changed its name to Equinor. Not quite sure what that means, but it doesn't mean Statoil. I attended the ONS conference, which is the biggest oil and gas conference in the world, which takes place every year in Norway. And it was the first time I attended earlier this year. And they gave me a keynote. I was very surprised, and it was a very receptive audience. But because in those circles not too many people know me, I could walk in and out of discussions unnoticed. And I can tell you there was a palpable sense of fear that something was happening. And what were the two views? One is, how do we stop this? But the predominant view was, this is going to happen, we have to understand the technology better, and we have to evolve our companies in a way that we can deal with this. And that is what the discussion that we're seeing in some of the majors today. That discussion is ongoing. So I think that we are in a intensely disruptive period. Part of this is going to be driven by finance. You can see already big insurance companies starting to price carbon risk. There are parts of New York State. I used to live just north of New York City. There were some prime properties on the sea that you can't insure anymore. There are parts of Miami and low-lying areas in Florida, prime real estate. Not sure if Mar-a-Lago is one of them, but they're uninsurable because the risk of flooding is just too high. So that has started to come in. We're seeing financial institutions starting to price carbon risk. Large pension funds banning investment in coal, moving slowly at pricing investment in fossil fuels much higher, providing incentives for risk mitigation for investment in renewable energy, lowering the cost of financing, understanding the structuring of financing in renewables because everything is upfront, so the sensitivity to policy framework, political risk, currency risk is extremely high for renewables. But the policy changes that we are seeing today are beginning to make that happen. So it's like a perfect storm right now. Technology is improving, innovation is happening, costs are decreasing, both of technology and levelized cost of electricity. We're seeing new business models emerging. We're seeing new entrants to the market. We're seeing competition that is driving down cost and driving innovation. We're seeing countries beginning to realize that the geopolitics of the future is not the geopolitics of a scarce resource that is geographically constrained. The geopolitics of energy of the future is the geopolitics of abundance, when the real resource is no longer what you dig out of the ground. The real resource is who has the best technology and who has access to that technology. That's the world that we are looking at. And all of these predictions that you see by incumbents are for different reasons. The big fossil companies don't want you to know this, so they will message in very different ways about how clean they are. I still remember this wonderful advertisement of Shell shortly after some oil spill. It's a very pretty girl canoeing through a pristine river looking at the wonderful nature, and that was the image that Shell was projecting. Very far from the reality. Today, they're coping with a situation where public perception, where movements of youth, of different social groups are all asking for disinvestment from fossils. The cost of financing is going up, the risk is going up, and the business model is no longer as vibrant as it once was. We have old institutions in energy that are still producing the prognosis they've been producing for the last 10 years. This is a very famous chart, which I keep in my room, where you show the actual installations of solar that go like this, and the predictions that every year the predictions were going like this. It's a wonderful chart, it's different colors, but it shows you how if you only use the mindset of the technology that we have today, and we use modeling techniques where we go back a little bit into the past and we say, oh, these are the trends and this is what we see and these are the marginal changes we're going to see, and you project it in the future, you're going to be wrong every single time. That's become true. You're going to be right if you start to anticipate what is happening in a very dynamic landscape that is changing the future of energy systems around the world, that is providing new opportunities, that has a potential to address systemic risks to the global community, and that has the potential to generate a next level of infrastructure investment, wealth generation, and prosperity. Where would you begin to look? So this is what we have today. The only question that remains in my mind is this going to be fast enough to meet the imperative of climate? Are we going to be able to decarbonize, to remain below, to remain at 1.5 or below 2? And my sense is that at least below 2 we may be able to manage, because I think the awareness that is building and the momentum that is building now is unstoppable. But it's still very risky. The risks of not doing it are much, much worse than the cost of doing it today. So that's my message to you. And I want to say how, first of all, how glad I'm to be here. When I first came here, I came from a developing country, ex-British colony. Our educational system was more British than what the British were doing. We called our teachers sir or madam. It was a very formal system, very rigorous on the basics. So when I came here and I sat in a seminar and I was told you're supposed to call your professor by the first name, it took me 6 months to get it out of my mouth. But I was very grateful to have come here, because this is a very special institution. It allowed you freedom and flexibility socially to discuss your political opinions. I also came from a place where you didn't talk in a loud voice about your political opinions, especially if they were different from the government in power. It was not a very healthy way of conducting yourself. It allowed you a sense of openness. And when I first came here, this was a fossil economy. And Margaret, when I was at the IDS, Margaret Thatcher was elected as Prime Minister. And within 1 year, the miners were on the streets. And as a student with a heart, if you saw the conditions that the miners were in, you could only sympathize. So I remember a bunch of us went up to London to support the miners in their strike. It's ironic that today I'm in a career which is trying to kill coal mining totally. That's how the world changes. So everything changes. And I think that this institution equips you with the flexibility of mind, with the openness of thought, with the concept of debate that allows you to be flexible to a future. And it's a privilege to be part of this, and it was a privilege for me to have been part of this. And I just want to know why it took you 30 years to invite me here. But thank you very much for listening. Totally different speech to what I was going to make, but
All right, so thank you. I forgot to mention, Nora, there was a hashtag there for you to use, but Nora's going to walk around with a microphone. So I know we've only got about 15 minutes because we do have a dinner we have to rush to. So I think we'll just go on a first come, first raise issue. Jeez. So Juliana, do you think you were first, and then you said next?
It's
really brief.
Okay, very brief. Thank you very much. Very enjoyable. I noticed you hadn't thrown hydrogen into the mix. I was wondering if you can give us some quick comments on how important you see hydrogen being in the mix.
I think hydrogen is going to be fundamentally important. I didn't think that a couple of years ago. But I think two things have convinced me. One is the ongoing discussion about power to gas. The fact that power is from renewables is going to be incredibly cheap, and there's going to be a certain amount of overcapacity, and generation of hydrogen makes a lot of economic sense. But a conversation I had at the UNS, which should be of interest to you, I was talking to the gas guys of the former Statoil. And they were very excited to talk to me because we had just issued this brief on hydrogen and the prospects for hydrogen. And they said, we really think there's something in this because, I don't know if you know, but there's a unique geological formation in Norway. Normally I think that CCS is a bunch of nonsense that fossil fuel companies start. But there's a unique geological formation of the Norwegian shelf that allows very cost-effective carbon storage. So they are thinking of using their carbon-based assets to generate hydrogen, use their gas distribution infrastructure, which needs almost no modification to transport hydrogen, and to become a hydrogen provider of clean hydrogen, zero carbon hydrogen to Europe. The Japanese are investing hugely, but they're thinking of generating it with coal, which is not such a great idea in my view. But I think the advent of power to gas as an important part of the policy discussion is now creating an economic case for hydrogen, and I'm seeing a lot of innovation also going into long-range transportation powered by hydrogen. I think it has huge potential for shipping and for freight, land freight. So I think there really is a possibility for hydrogen now.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for your meeting. My question is, we had a previous experience for the energy transmission from the one source to the other source. And for example, we had an experience from the coal to the like oil and gas, and now from the oil and gas to the renewable energy. Which part of that is most challenging? From different research from Professor Savakol, for example, explained we have to consider all the elements, all the part of that. We have to study all of that.
Yeah.
But which one is most challenging part for this transmission?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it's the fact that you're dealing with a systemic issue now, which is a systemic change. It's not a change of fuels. It's not a change of sources. It's a change of the ecosystem that we're looking at. And I think that one of the biggest challenges for many economies so far has been that the infrastructure of today isn't adequate for the system of tomorrow. So in the grid infrastructure we have today, to be able to have large quantities of intermittent renewables in the system and to be able to manage that flexibly has been a major challenge. It's been exaggerated by some of the incumbent utilities because they talk about system costs as if this is the only source for which there are system costs. But essentially, the development of markets, policies, regulations, and understanding the infrastructure better is an area that needs a lot of improvement in a number of countries. But there are some countries that are already pioneering these changes.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm actually working on my PhD at IDS, so I'm glad to see some alumni representing the institution. Before I started my PhD, I was working with the International Finance Corporation on renewable energy and resource efficiency. And a lot of what you said sounds very familiar, especially not putting this at all in terms of climate change and speaking a conversation around things like structuring finance and how we're actually going to support these renewable energy projects to get off the ground. But the question I have for you is often in this conversation it becomes very technical and it becomes very exclusionary, and we often forget about the governance trade-offs that are involved with thinking of renewable energy as though they happen in a political vacuum. And I'm curious how we can, in the vision that you have for this optimistic grand future, how we can guarantee that it is both participatory and democratic, and it's not just skipping entire communities out of the conversation.
That's a fundamental point, and I skipped over that a little bit, but I said, there are the 3 Ds. There's democratization, there's digitalization, and decentralization. The democratization is a shorthand way of saying that this needs to be a much more inclusive type of energy system in the future than we've had in the past. We've had big people generating big amounts of power and selling it to little people. It's not going to be like that anymore. So our conversation has to be completely different. This has to be discussed with people in a completely different way. There will be new actors in the marketplace, and the interesting thing is that how dynamic this is. So let me give you a small example. We recently had the International Off-Grid Renewable Energy Conference, so we're looking at the issue of energy access. It's very hard to find statistics on renewable energy technology imports for off-grid access. And we recently discovered why that is, because they're not reflected in energy statistics. They're only reflected in trade statistics as equipment that's being imported into the country. So we've gone through all the trade statistics, and we found a very interesting picture. You have the traditional development agencies that make their living from getting funding from donors by talking about all the problems that are happening in the country, so you need to give us money to help the poor. You normally end up helping the bureaucracies more, but if you look at the energy that is there, the small and medium-sized enterprises, the new entrants in this discussion, we have now pay-as-you-go companies that are pioneering these systems in Africa. They're connecting tens of thousands of people. We've estimated that in the last 7 years, 133 million people have gained access to electricity, majority in lighting, but others in other uses. These new pay-as-you-go systems are based on devices that are becoming better and cheaper, better solar PV, better storage, cheaper prices, and the remarkable thing is, you're from IDS, so you should know this, the M-Pesa, have you heard of M-Pesa? M-Pesa was an app pioneered in Kenya by Kenyan entrepreneurs, which was a mobile application to move money around. It's become the standard for many applications in many parts of the world today. 2 weeks ago, a young Kenyan, I keep saying everything was 2 weeks ago, it feels like that, maybe this was 3 weeks ago. A young Kenyan entrepreneur, with his own money, bought a ticket, came to Abu Dhabi, and he said he wanted to come and meet me. So I said, okay, sure. He was a young electrical engineer. He told me, I'm head of a startup, and I'm thinking of doing something big on off-grid. And I said, what are you thinking of doing? He said, I'm pioneering the development of an app that will connect me remotely, without any wiring or anything, to all these off-grid systems around the country. And I will be able to see in real time the same way that the China state grid manages 1.2 billion people's electricity. He will be able to manage the off-grid electrical appliances that are running throughout the country. You will be able, with those systems now, because new efficient appliances are coming into the market, to buy appliances that can run off-grid solar very efficiently. This includes water pumping, hammer mills, even welding machines. You will be able to provide to rural clinics. This is a major problem in Africa, that there is no electricity, so you cannot have refrigerators for vaccines. You cannot have basic facilities in health centers that save lives. This off-grid capability gives you the ability to do that. And it's developing a positive business case, and it shows you that all the people you consider to be rural poor are able to pay a small amount for that kind of provision of services which are life-changing for them. And what this does also, it's a kind of income generation tool that is having transformative effects in many countries. And a lot of that innovation in business models and in technology is happening in countries in the South. What we're seeing now, final point on this, is that the business case for mini-grids and microgrids today in remote settings is absolutely unbeatable. It's far superior to diesel generation. But what we're seeing is the technologies of these mini-grids and microgrids is also ready for grid arrival. So the ecosystem of the future will be able to integrate all of these facilities into it at some point in time when the grid arrives, if it ever arrives, or if we have virtual utilities that will be existing in rural areas. So I think this is by definition a very inclusive process that is happening, but we have to take great care that it's nurtured in that way and it doesn't become yet again another grab. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one very, very quick question and a very quick answer.
Okay.
We're already over time.
It's a difficult concept, I suppose, but my question is obviously taking into account the development of IoT, AI, and taking into account your triple-D perspective. Where do you think that blockchain in particular stands for both microtransactions and for the democratization of energy, taking into account obviously its modularity?
It's a game changer. blockchain's a game changer.
Completely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, basically, blockchain takes to the next level what I was talking about in terms of markets that can trade in minutes. With blockchain, you can trade in seconds. You can trade
literally
huge quantities. You can understand how to manage the market in a completely different way. You can have more entrants in the market. So I think this is going to be there. It's not visible too clearly yet. It's going to evolve over time, but I think it's going to be a central part of how we manage energy in the future, electricity.
Well, thank you very much again for coming. Everyone have a great evening. We hope to see many of you at other SEG seminars. They won't be quite as good as this one, myself included, but you are welcome to come.